On the morning of January 5th, 1909, Reverend John Haviland Carmichael kissed his wife goodbye, climbed into his horse and buggy, and rode off into the freezing Michigan winter. He told her he was heading to the Rattle Run Church to take care of some business. His wife had no reason to worry. Her husband was a respected Methodist minister who served 3 rural churches in St. Clair County: Rattle Run, Adair, and China. And at 56 years old, he'd built a reputation as a pious man of God. They had 3 children together, and by all appearances, the Carmichael family lived the perfect Christian life. But what happened later that day inside the tiny Rattle Run Church would shock the entire state of Michigan and become one of the most bizarre murder cases in American history. Because when church caretaker Myron Brown walked into that building the next afternoon, he discovered something that no one could have imagined. The church was a slaughterhouse. But before we dive into today's story, if you love disturbing historical mysteries and shocking true crime cases told through detailed narrative storytelling, then you've found the right channel. Because that's exactly what I do here, and I upload new stories 3 to 4 times every week. So if that interests you, smash the like button and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future uploads. All right, let's get into today's story, which takes place in the small town of Rattle Run, Michigan in January of 1909. Rattle Run was a tiny rural community in Columbia Township, southwest of Port Huron, named after the rattling rapids of Columbus Creek that ran nearby. The town was so small it barely appeared on maps, just a cluster of farms and a few buildings, including a modest Methodist church where the locals gathered every Sunday. Reverend John Haviland Carmichael had come to St. Clair County back in 1899 after serving successfully in the South and Nebraska. He'd been ordained as a Methodist minister in 1880, and over the years, he'd risen steadily through the ranks of the Detroit Conference. By 1906, he was trusted enough to be appointed pastor of 3 different rural churches simultaneously, quite an honor in those days. His family lived in the nearby town of Adair, where the Reverend was well known and well liked by most of his congregation. But recently, some people had noticed that Reverend Carmichael was acting a bit strange. He'd been working on a manuscript for a book, and according to his own wife, it wasn't the kind of book you'd expect from a man of the cloth. She later described it as lurid and trashy, and she'd actually confronted him about it, telling him he shouldn't be writing such things. But Carmichael persisted anyway, secretively working on his controversial manuscript. Around this same time, the Reverend had struck up an unusual friendship with a man named Amos Gideon Browning. Now, Gideon Browning was about as different from Reverend Carmichael as you could get. He was a carpenter and part-time sailor from Adair, known around town as something of a roustabout. He drank, he gambled, and he had a reputation for erratic behavior. Some folks whispered that Browning wasn't quite right in the head. They called him short-minded, which in those days was a polite way of saying someone had mental deficiencies. But for some reason, Reverend Carmichael had taken an interest in Browning. According to witnesses, the Reverend wanted Browning to work as an agent to help sell and promote his mysterious book manuscript. The Reverend's daughter later told police that her father had visited Browning the day before the murder and promised him a job where he would have to do nothing but stand around and smoke cigars. Whatever that meant, it was enough to get Browning's attention. On the morning of January 5th, multiple witnesses saw Reverend Carmichael and Gideon Browning talking at the train depot in Adair. The Reverend paid for Browning's ticket, and Browning boarded the train to Port Huron on some kind of errand. Later that same day, Browning took the train back, but oddly, he didn't ride all the way home to Adair. Instead, he got off at a station called Hickey and asked 2 different men for directions to the Rattle Run Church, telling each of them that he had an appointment to meet someone there. And that was the last time anyone saw Gideon Browning alive. The next day, January 6th, around noon, Myron Brown, the church caretaker who lived nearby, was standing at a crossroads near the Rattle Run Church, waiting to keep an appointment. The freezing winter air drove him to seek shelter inside the church. He pushed open the door and immediately stopped in his tracks. Blood. There was blood everywhere, splattered across the floor, smeared on the pews, coating the communion table, dripping from the pulpit. Shreds of blood-soaked clothing were strewn throughout the small building, and a wicked-looking knife lay in plain sight. Brown stumbled back outside and immediately summoned Sheriff Wagansell from Port Huron. When the sheriff and his deputies arrived at the scene, they were hit by an overwhelming smell, something foul and sickeningly sweet emanating from inside the church. They traced it to the 2 furnaces used to heat the building. With growing dread, they opened the front furnace. Inside, they found part of a dismembered human torso. They opened the rear furnace. More body parts. Someone had been chopped to pieces and burned inside this house of God. The flames in the furnaces were still smoldering, which meant this had happened recently. The police doused the fires and carefully recovered what remained of the body. Most of the corpse had been completely consumed by the flames, but they managed to retrieve part of the trunk, a jawbone, some false teeth, and a few coins that had been in the victim's pockets. The coins ruled out robbery as a motive. But whose body was this? And where was Reverend Carmichael? The next morning, January 7th, a farmer found the Reverend's horse tied to a tree in Pine River, about 20 miles from the Rattle Run Church. The Reverend's overcoat was still in the carriage. Pine River was located right on the Grand Trunk Railroad line, which made it look like someone had brutally murdered the beloved Reverend and then fled by train. The entire community was horrified. Who would do such a thing to a man of God? But then investigators noticed something strange. Reverend Carmichael wasn't the only person missing from the area. Gideon Browning hadn't been seen since the day before either, and witnesses came forward with information about the 2 men meeting, about Browning boarding that train, about him asking for directions to the church. Then came the breakthrough. A dentist examined the false teeth found in the furnace ashes and positively identified them as belonging to Gideon Browning. The shocking truth began to dawn on everyone. The body in the furnaces wasn't the Reverend. It was Browning. Which meant Reverend John Haviland Carmichael was not a victim. He was a murderer. A massive manhunt began. Police contacted law enforcement agencies across multiple states, and while they searched, Reverend Carmichael was already hundreds of miles away. He'd shaved off his beard, traveled to Carthage, Illinois, and was posing as a man named John Elder, telling locals he was a cabinet maker passing through town looking for a site to build a factory. He rented a room at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Hughes. But his behavior was bizarre. He refused to eat, claiming he was fasting. When Mrs. Hughes made him a large breakfast the next morning, thinking he'd be starving, he simply gathered his belongings, paid his bill, and said he was leaving for a job 12 miles away. A few moments later, Mrs. Hughes heard a noise coming from the shed behind her house. She was scared to look herself, so she called a neighbor. When a mailman walked by, they asked him to check. He opened the shed door and found John Elder lying on the floor in a growing pool of blood, a knife in his hands. He'd slashed his own throat. He was still alive, but barely. The local sheriff arrived and found 2 letters on the dying man. One was addressed to Mrs. Carmichael in Adair. The other was addressed to Sheriff Wagonsell in Port Huron. Both letters were almost identical, and they contained a full confession. The man calling himself John Elder was actually Reverend John Haviland Carmichael, and he'd murdered Gideon Browning in the Rattle Run Church. But the reason he gave for the murder was absolutely bizarre. In the letter, Carmichael wrote, "The man had such a hypnotic influence over me that I felt that something must be done. I felt greatly ashamed that a man said to be short-minded could be able to compel me to yield to his will." He described how Browning would look at him in the queerest sort of a look, something like the look of a snake's eyes. Then I felt his influence tightening his grip on my mind. According to Carmichael's confession, Browning had some kind of supernatural power over him and could make him do things against his will, like walk through manure or raise his arms on command like a puppet. Carmichael believed Browning was using some form of hypnosis or occult power to control him. The letter described what happened inside the church that night. According to Carmichael, when they entered the building, Browning was holding a hatchet. The Reverend grabbed it away from him. Then Browning pulled out 2 knives and began chasing Carmichael around the church. Carmichael threw the hatchet, and it hit Browning. Then, to finish the job, he grabbed one of the knives and stabbed him repeatedly. Then came a few more chops from the hatchet to make sure Browning was dead. In a state of complete panic, and what can only be described as psychotic frenzy, Carmichael then did the unthinkable. He spent hours cutting Browning's body into pieces small enough to fit into the church furnaces. He stuffed the body parts into both furnaces and lit them. He switched clothes with the dead man, hoping to make it look like he was the victim. Then he fled into the night, leaving behind a scene of absolute carnage. Just hours after writing his confession letters, Reverend John Haviland Carmichael died in that shed in Illinois from blood loss and exposure. He never regained consciousness. He was 56 years old. The confession raised more questions than it answered. 3 days after Carmichael's death, 4 Detroit physicians performed an autopsy on his body. They discovered that the Reverend had suffered from several brain abnormalities. Mental illness ran in his family, and many who knew him believed he'd been slowly losing his mind for some time. As for Gideon Browning's supposed hypnotic powers, his widow, who lived in Auburn, New York, stated for the record that her husband had no occult abilities whatsoever and had never studied hypnotism. He was just a simple carpenter and sailor. The New York Times even published an editorial about the case, noting that it's impossible to hypnotize someone against their will, and it's also impossible to make a hypnotized person do something they wouldn't ordinarily do. The medical consensus was clear. Reverend Carmichael had mistaken his own symptoms of insanity for hypnotism and had turned violently on the man he'd come to see as his persecutor. But why was he writing that strange, lurid book? What was he planning with Browning? What really happened in that church? We'll never know the complete truth. The Rattle Run Church is long gone now, torn down decades ago. The town itself has faded from memory, but the empty lot where the church once stood, at the northwest corner of Rattle Run Road and Mayer Road, still remains. And the story of what happened there in January 1909 continues to be told as one of Michigan's most gruesome and bizarre murders. A respected minister who believed he was under a supernatural spell, a dismembered body burning in church furnaces, a confession written in the final moments before suicide. It's a case that reminds us how fragile the human mind can be, and how quickly religious devotion can twist into something dark and terrifying when mental illness goes unchecked. So that's gonna do it. Until next time, see ya.